Welcome. Welcome to tonight's Transport Talk Show. We're coming to you from COP23 in Bonn, Germany, and specifically from the headquarters of DHL Post Tower, who's graciously sponsored this lovely venue, so we're very grateful for that. This COP23 of the UNFCCC, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, is under the Fijian presidency, and our objective of these transport talk shows is really to bring what's happening here with its estimated 20,000 participants in Bonn, Germany, out to all of you, some of you listening here in Bonn, but also many of you who are not here, and specifically related to transportation, which of course affects all of us in our life every day, we hope, and how it can be improved and be more sustainable. Before we get to our special guest tonight, we have three wonderful guests working on finance in particular. There's a couple housekeeping orders. One in particular, for those of you in the house, please mute or silence your phone so you do not disturb the show. It's very much appreciated. Another thanks goes out, of course, I'm sorry, to PPMC, which is the Paris Process on Mobility and Climate, who is sponsoring these shows. They're a collaboration or initiative between SLoCaT, which is Sustainable Low Carbon Partnership on Transportation, and Michelin's Moving On. Also, if you're interested in submitting a question tonight or for future nights, please send in your questions to #WeAreTransport, #WeAreTransport. We have a team of people who are fielding those questions and can bring them right up to us. Also, we have a Facebook chat room for those of you watching this on Facebook, so feel free to do that. I think that's all the housekeeping rules. So we're going to move now on to our theme for tonight. Each night has a new theme, so tonight's very important theme is on finance. A lot of people are dedicated to transportation and sustainable transportation and all of its issues, but really it can't get done unless you have the money. So we have some representatives who've been working on this issue for their entire careers and are experts in the field, leading not only their own work, but many in working in coalitions in this space as well. So we're very fortunate to have them here. The first one is Jorge Kogan from CAF, which is the Development Bank of Latin America. Maybe before we sort of deep dive, you can tell us a bit about why you're here in Bonn for COP23.
Yeah, hello, thank you for
Yes.
the presentation. Well, this is the climate change conference, and probably this is a key issue for the humanity. As a development bank, we should be here because this is an important issue. But on top of this is the opportunity to meet with other organizations and banks for meetings that go in parallel with the main conference. In this case, the multilateral development banks have a group that is working on sustainable transport. We have also are part of an initiative, it's called Sustainable Mobility for All, where there are like 50 or 60 different international institutions, and other groups that are really working in looking at the climate change and related this to the transport, which is one of the key elements in damaging the environment and the climate, and transport is, as you mentioned in the presentation, a key aspect in our daily lives. So we have to do something about that, and this is an opportunity to gather all the different institutions and people that is involved in this issue together and continue the discussions and help the countries that are in these meetings to improve the quality of their policies and the decisions that they have to make in order to favor the climate.
Absolutely. So for those people who are, I mean, everyone hears about the high demand for climate finance, and as many of you know, in 2010, the developed states pledged to deliver $100 billion per year annually by 2020 to solve this climate crisis. The money is slowly rolling in, and there's many routes for these financial flows. And one of them is the multilateral development banks, of which CAF is one. Can you sort of explain in how this works, how the development banks function, and yours in particular, to really support countries to deliver on climate and transport in particular, of course?
Yeah, well, the multilateral development banks, and in this case CAF, is not only provided finance, which is our main operational task, but this is finance going together with help to the countries to improve the quality of their institutions, the quality of the policies that they take, to learn how to make better use of the money. And we also have a fairly clear catalytic role by which when a multilateral development bank goes into a country and do some lending, other lenders are prepared to lend. Money, for a lot of people, seems to be the key issue. And really, one must say that there is a lot of finance around the world, although there are not so many projects that are available, that are bankable for the finance to come into those projects. So this is a kind of tricky issue, but this is a real one. And climate finance and green finance are related to the main topic of this conference, and in reality for the countries is cheaper money. But that's all. There is either cheaper or not so cheaper money available, and not all that money is going to the project, because in many countries that are claiming for money, begging for money, in the end, when you go with the money, there are no projects ready to be financed.
And what do you mean by cheaper money? Maybe you can explain that a little bit. Do you mean lower
reducing interest rates, but this is going to be
lower interest rates, loan-free, non-conditional?
For general public, this is not going to be something very interesting. I think that I think the issue, and this is important for people to understand, is that there is a belief that the main reason for which projects are not implemented is because there is not enough finance. And this is not true. There is the cases in where the finance is there, but the countries or the cities are not solid enough to repay their lending. And in many cases, as I mentioned it before, there are not good plans, there are not good projects for the finance to come and put the money. You would not go and buy a car without wheels, without seats. You would like to buy a car in case you buy a car, or you buy a suit, which is what you want to buy.
Yeah.
And many times projects are not prepared in a proper way.
Yeah.
And this has a lot to do with the quality of the governmental institutions.
Yeah. So maybe let's turn that on its head, because it sounds like, so you do hear a lot. You hear a lot that there's not enough bankable projects. That the funds are out there, and it's basically looking for a latching point to a bankable project. And there are criticisms about why that isn't the case. Can you define sort of what does a good bankable project look like? What is the flip side of that look like?
Well, a good bankable projects, and if you
does it have to be at scale? I don't know.
If you look from the perspective of a multilateral development bank, is a project that is well defined, and this means that is part of a plan that is looking at the impacts and is promoting development, that has been very well analyzed in terms of the social and the environmental frameworks, and that is reasonable, has a priority compared to other projects, and the finance of the project, that is what the project is going to generate, whether this is in revenue or in development, is going to be matched to the cost of that project.
So if it's, a follow-up to that would be, so if it's the benefits could be both in profit, or you mentioned they could social development. Would that be a bankable project if health would be improved by the recipients of a project, or equity would be improved? Is that considered a bankable project? If it could be, somehow monitored or externalized,
The theory of the analysis is very basic. It's 50, 60 years old. If the benefits are higher than the cost, that is a good project. When you go into the benefits, sometimes the benefits are monetary, and this is what commercial banks will ask for. But multilateral development banks or other concessional funding will put in the list of the benefits, social benefits, development benefits, other benefits that you can probably measure them in monetary terms, but sometimes not. But this is why there are development banks. The development banks are looking into that and helping the countries to put in place the indirect benefits or the non-monetary benefits.
Okay, so if we were to say with transportation, if you were to decrease, if new urban planning design with more sustainable transportation was to decrease congestion, decrease pollution, and therefore increase the health of people living there, and you could monetize that somehow, which is tough to do. It takes tough metrics, right? You have to, what is the improvement of the health of, asthma for children and longer lifespans, et cetera. But you could basically say there's a health benefit. Multi-development MDBs, multilateral development banks, would somehow say, yes, that counts as a...
Yeah.
That's good.
Yes, we do that.
Sounds good.
In terms of sustainability, and many of the multilateral development banks around the world have been accused of financing projects that were not sustainable. Why is that? Because historically, multilateral development banks have been financing rural roads. And rural roads, because that is an evident benefit for people that is isolated, that needs to get connected with hospitals, education, and so on, or because there are productions in the rural areas that need to go to the markets. In 2012, during Rio +20, the 8 multilateral development banks around the world made a commitment to start switching their finance of transport projects into sustainable transport projects.
Yes.
And we have committed $175 billion, not additional lending, but $175 billion we are going to go during the next 10 years, starting 2013, into sustainable projects. And this is something
new funding.
And this is what has been going on, and there is a monitoring process that is going on, showing how banks are going from financing projects that were not so sustainable into more sustainable projects. And this is a contribution that the multilateral development banks are producing now, and trying to catalyze through that action the funding of other sources into sustainable projects.
And I understand they're doing pretty well on that. They're delivering against that pledge at a decent rate, actually.
Right. And
can you speak to that?
Yeah. Well, we have put year goals, and those goals have been, after 5 years, been working properly well. CAF in particular have clearly moved from financing almost 100% of the transport projects were rural roads. We have gone now into financing a lot of urban transport projects. Latin America is the most urbanized continent of the world. More than 80% of the people lives in cities. The average of the world is 50. And we are focusing our attention in financing urban transport projects, because there is where the costs are, where the needs are, where the environment is more damaged, and where we think we can help not only the cities and the people of the cities, but improving the quality of the transport system in the cities. You improve the productivity and the efficiency of the whole country, because the cities are where they're concentrated, the thinking, the finance, the administration. So in the last few years, we've been financing metros in Panama, in Quito, in Lima, BRTs, public transport systems in Buenos Aires, in Santiago, in Montevideo, in 4 or 5 cities in Colombia. So what we said we were going to do, and we committed a figure, but on top of that, we had been focusing and putting the money in specific projects, in specific cities, for specific people.
Excellent. And I know you're very involved in the Sustainable Mobility for All initiative, so you're, I imagine, trying to adhere to sort of that holistic approach to not only being low carbon, but also being safe and and accessible for all.
Particularly in that initiative, our main contribution is that we are leading the team that is working on the road safety side.
Excellent.
Which is our kind of leading, flag.
Excellent, excellent. So as our time is wrapping up here, we have that one critical question we've been asking everybody to make a sort of bouquet of solutions. So please don't answer in no silver bullet, but in your area of work, if you can answer and say, what is one very specific and pragmatic action that can transform the transport sector right now?
If I had to make my personal choice, one action will be education. I will educate the public government officials to improve the quality of the projects that they do, and will educate people for claiming for their rights and get the right transport services that they need. And with that, I think not only is an action that will probably transform transportation, but will make a long-term transformation, which is what we need.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. I fully agree. Education is a foundation to so much, including sustainable transportation, health, so much. Thank you so much. Very informative. We're very glad to have you here. And if you can stay till the end, we'll very much hope you can, we'll come back up for a Q&A. So be thinking about what you might want to ask Jorge at the end. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yes, you can leave your microphone here. Thanks. And we're going to pivot over here to our next guests. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Klaus and David, I'm going to ask you to basically introduce yourself so that I don't, underestimate your amazing careers here. Let's start with you, Klaus. If you can just maybe explain to everybody a little bit about, you're from KfW, but what is KfW, and specifically, what are you doing here at COP23?
Yeah, thank you, Tracy. I think some people may not know KfW. We are the German Development Bank, and we have been founded after the Second World War to reconstruct Germany that has been destroyed. And for the last 50 years, our focus has shifted, and we have doing more and more financing in developing countries. And I'm dealing, among others, in the sector policy division with transport and with sustainable transport. And I think this COP is so important for sustainable transport because in many other areas, in power sector, in industry, we have made over the last 20 years quite some progress with regards to shifting to a more climate-friendly way how we produce our power, how we are doing industry production, industrial production. In transport, at least in many countries, hardly anything has happened, and that's why I believe transport is an extremely important issue for a conference like a COP.
Yes.
That's one thing, but there is more to it, I believe, because Jorge alluded to it. There is health problems, there is accidents, there is time that's been lost. I mean, you have probably all been to one of African or Asian big cities, and you have been spending hours and hours in a taxi or in a car. And we need to address these issues to unleash the potential of many cities.
Absolutely. It's very true. The time lost in that could be used for leisure,
whatever,
but also for economic productivity, education that was mentioned, a lot of other things, absolutely. And I realized I didn't mention your last name, Gihr, Klaus Gihr. So pleasure to have you here. Thanks for that introduction. And David Rodgers from GEF, Global Environmental Facility of the United Nations. And maybe you can give a brief introduction of what you're doing here at COP23 and a little bit about the GEF.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Tracy. It's a pleasure to be here. The GEF is an operating entity in the financial mechanism of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So naturally, we're here in Bonn and happy to do so because we meet with our countries, we make presentations, we receive guidance from the COP, and in particular, guidance on what to invest in. And the GEF is a multilateral funded donor institution that disperses grants to recipient countries in the developing world to fight climate change and other environmental challenges. So of course, transport is a very important area for the GEF, along with other sustainable energy, land, forests, water, and more. So for us, as Jorge and Klaus have mentioned, we are here to hear from our countries and to hear from the parties to the convention on where the next frontiers of investment in sustainable transport should be aimed at and how we can help support that.
Excellent, thank you. So we're going to spend a little bit of time diving into the details of KfW, and then we're going to go back to the Jeff.
Sure.
Thank you so much. So tonight's theme is finance, right? And infrastructure overall is expected to require about $90 trillion of investment in the next 15 years, all of it new investment. And of course that includes sanitation and water as well as roads and other elements of infrastructure. But, and all of these financial flows are going to be required to make sure that, that's delivered upon with a climate-friendly, sustainable, inclusive, equitable manner. And banks such as, development banks, the funds through the United Nations, and there's many of them besides the Jeff, but Jeff has been really critical at the forefront of this, are going to be critical for it. Can you explain in a nuts and bolts way sort of how KfW works to invest and support countries on the ground?
Yes. I mean, we are part of the German official bilateral assistance system, and we are under the guidance of the German government, and we implement on their behalf the German bilateral aid. And we come to the table after the government of Germany and the government, say, in any country in the developing world, have agreed on focal areas of the cooperation. And for instance, if that is transport, then we ask our recipient countries, what are your priorities? And then we have a process of discussion where we hope to find well-prepared project. And Jorge mentioned it quite clearly that this is a bottleneck. I mean, we all know that the figures you just mentioned, 100 trillions or whatever,
90 trillion in the next 15
I also
years.
heard something 120. I mean, the figures are really gigantic.
Astronomical.
I mean, we all know that the money is not there at the time being. But I would be happy if we, for the next 2 or 5 years, would have a project pipeline that is well prepared and that would be ready to roll. Very often, this is not the case, and we need to do, say, very often environmental and social studies. The question of the benefits is often needs more work, and we could do more if projects would be more mature. They very often lack a level of maturity that would enable us and our peers to do more and to get closer to the 90, 100, 110 trillions.
That's interesting. It speaks a bit about what he said about education, right? That in a way you're referring to maybe the skill sets or lack of corruption or what have you. What is it, if we were to again turn that on its head about, well, how do we get to a place where you have the project pipeline that then the funds can find those projects?
I believe it's an issue that in many countries it's a once-in-a-lifetime event to, for instance, to start a bus system. I mean, we in Germany, we have faced and we are facing huge problems with our large infrastructure projects. The airport in Berlin is almost a textbook case for delays, for poor management, for cost overruns, what have you. And I'm sure in many countries you have similar cases. And what are we expecting in a city, not the capital, but a small city in any African country where there is little expertise in financing, where there's little engineering expertise, where there's little managerial expertise in the public sector? We know that there are bottlenecks and there are very often deficiencies in that area. And they cannot be just overcome at a snap of a finger. That will take time, I'm afraid.
So can you maybe speak on absolutely, it does take time, and we're talking about, really skill sets, capacity building, good governance. A lot of magic pieces have to be pulled together. Can you cite good examples of where this has been successful?
I mean, first of all, it's important that we and also our peers, we have funds available for financing additional studies. I have the impression that, for instance, in a number of Northern African countries, there is now a critical mass for also complex projects. For instance, in Morocco, this is now not transport, but this power sector. I think they have accumulated a critical mass for the various renewable energy plants. We have had good experience in a number of Latin American countries. We are funding a project in the southern Indian city of Kochi, where that has been done, the necessary preparatory work, which is quite complex as there's lots of islands, and where we are funding water taxis, and also the city is setting up a system of light train and integrating the various modes of transport, which also increases ridership.
Yeah, yeah, excellent. So there are some good practices out there. It's just, they're maybe not as many as we want to see, it sounds
Definitely
like, yeah.
not.
And it's interesting, I've heard some good examples where people have said, you know, funding the preparatory work to prepare a bankable project is actually some of the most critical work that the developing, supporting agencies can provide, is to actually help prepare those bankable projects, all from capacity building through design.
We can assist, yes,
and have you.
but we also have limitations in terms of money and
Resources.
also
Yeah.
resources. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want the big question now or later? About what
Later.
is the one thing? Okay, you've
I
got
brace.
more time to think. All right. So, David, so the Global Environment Facility, a lot of expectations. You do a lot of work related, from everything from mangroves to forestry, agriculture, other things as well. But in transportation in particular, how is this going? Is it scaling up? Is it scaling down? Because there's quite a bit of expectations on what your facility can deliver.
Right, thank you so much. Well, having been around for 25 years and working with great institutions like the CAF, KfW, the World Bank, the UN organizations, we've seen pretty much every type of transport project, starting with bus rapid transit, which we helped fund in Colombia, Mexico. We've helped with energy efficiency in the Indian railways, and we're currently working in China with electric drive vehicles. And I think the important part is that the GEF is a grant-making facility. Therefore, our resources can often be used by the recipient governments to create the conditions for greater access to finance. So for example, if we need to build institutional capacity within the institutions, if we need to help them build a regulatory or policy reforms to enable sustainable transport, if we need to help provide incremental cost so that the investment for the new technology or the new approach can help be made more cost effective. These are areas where the GEF can actually help partner with a bank or an MDB to make a sustainable transport project more acceptable to the country. Yeah. So I think in terms of project preparation, we would be happy to work with our recipient countries to help them identify the projects for sustainable transport and see if they can use the GEF funding to help do that hard work at the very beginning. Yeah. That's very difficult to finance. And then we can work with our partners like KfW and CAF to provide the bulk of the financing to actually make the investments.
That's sort of that preparatory project preparation, right. the phase one, if you will, of getting that transformation done.
Yes.
That's fantastic. And do you, so how do you see transportation fitting into that in particular? Because it sounds like you've had lots of experience in the past. Where do you see it going?
For us, we feel that sustainable transport, as Klaus said, is really just about to come into its own. If you were to look back at where renewable energy came in the last 10 years and where energy efficiency investments have progressed in the last 10 years, we now have so much more capacity to deliver on business-friendly, cost-effective investments. But sustainable transport is still just on the cutting edge. One of the areas that GEF will be focusing on is electric drive technologies, including energy storage, infrastructure, and e-mobility. And we think that this is very exciting right now. You just have to pick up the newspapers and read about the countries that have made a commitment to transition to 100% electric technologies in 10 years or 20 years. At the GEF, we want to make sure that all the developing countries have an opportunity to join that electric vehicle revolution, because it's going to be critical to solving the climate change problem, but also very helpful to the local cities in their local air pollution challenges.
Yeah, provided it's done, the electric mobility is low carbon, fueled by low carbon
I
sources.
think there's some
It has
very
to be,
good
but yeah.
there's some very good research that was
Yeah.
just published this week that indicates that electric drive technologies are so superior that even if you still have some fossil fuels in your electricity generation mix, you're going to have a net climate benefit from using those electric technologies.
Well, it's interesting. We had a really good question from the audience last night about leapfrogging technology.
Yep.
Is that can that be, is that philosophy or phenomenon applicable in transportation as it was with mobile technology? And I think that's maybe one of the cases where it is, sort of the automation aspect or the electric
Right.
mobility, where we're going to skip over the chug-mobile combustion engine and get to a cleaner vehicle.
I think you're probably right. If we just look at what's happening with the bike sharing programs, and some of those, thousands and thousands of those bikes are electric bikes, and those allow people who don't own a car to quickly make a transportation on demand through an app on their phone, and a carbon-free bike. They can then take their trip, save energy, save the planet. I'd like to see those same technologies applied more and more across the globe. In Asia, we have two-wheelers and three-wheelers that are prime candidates for electric conversion. We also have buses and light-duty vehicles that we think we're just on the cusp of a revolution in the transition to these types of technologies.
The greatest market share of two-wheel electric vehicles is growing in China.
Right.
Do you have any examples of sort of your pet projects that you think are really emblematic of the good work in transportation that you're supporting that you want to share with before we go to the last questions?
I think we've been very, very pleased with the types of projects where we're able to do the preparatory work that you mentioned, where we're able to go in and help the country establish the enabling environment through policy and regulatory reform. We like to say that as a three-legged stool: technology, policy, and finance. So if the GEF can help fund the technology work, that's doubtful. The corporations, private sector, research institutions do that work. But as soon as it becomes commercially available, then the GEF can help with the policy and the regulatory reform, and our partners at the banks can come in and provide the finance.
Excellent. I'm really glad we had you both together to sort of show that there are solutions. It's about preparing a good project, getting it done, and then the finance is there to follow. That's excellent. All right, I hope you've had time to prepare for the last question. Again, you only get one answer. I've had people try to sneak in up to 3, so take this quite seriously now. One thing, and it's okay, together we make a bouquet of answers. What is the one thing that could happen right now to transform the transport sector? Klaus.
Transport sector transformation would definitely require well-prepared and more projects. And for electricity mobility in Africa, regular power supply.
Regular power supply specifically in Africa. Very good point. Clean, regular. See, and there I am filling in for you. So I should have. That's your answer, not mine.
I take it for granted.
Thank you. Very good. Yes, David.
Well, the GEF would like to encourage developing countries to begin the preparation for the transformation to an electric vehicle, electric drive technologies that will help lower greenhouse gas emissions and solve local air quality problems.
Excellent. Fantastic. Thank you so much. So stay here, and we're going to ask Jorge from CAF to come back up. And maybe if you need help putting the microphone up, we'll get it. We had one question from Twitter last night that we're going to have asked again, because this is the audience that it should have been designed for. and then we have some help with your microphone, and then we'll see if there's other questions from the audience. So we sort of answered this question already, but let's tease it out. So the question came from Twitter, and no name attached to it, but the question was, how can we scale up and increase more funds for transportation, for climate and for transportation? So I think the person was assuming there wasn't enough and that they want to mobilize more. But let's start with that. That was the question. How can we, I have it in my mind from last night, how can we mobilize more finance for climate and transport?
Yeah, I believe it's crucial and it's really vital to tap also the local available funds. So far, very often it's a team of development financiers are teaming, a group of developing financiers are teaming up, and they're funding more or less 85% or 70% of the total cost. But in many countries, there is plenty of domestic finance available, and I think it's also vital to be more catalytic in our work with a view to bring the local funding to the table. Because you had a number of typical problems and risks you can avoid, notably the currency mismatch risk, if you do more local financing.
Good. Thank you. Good point. Did you look like you had an answer on the tip of your tongue?
Yeah, I think that the need for mobilizing more funds for this type of project is like isolating the financial world in one way or the other, because there is the interest of the international community to improve the quality of the projects, to make projects more sustainable, and there are all these international institutions trying to push for this. But the decision-making process is taking place somewhere else. This is in the countries, and within the countries, whether it is a national government or subnational government or a city government, is there where they have to make the decision of what projects, what finance, what for, what sectors. And finance could be unlimited worldwide. There is money everywhere, but as a citizen, you go to the bank, and the bank has millions and millions of euros. You cannot take all those euros for you.
Right.
There is a limit, right?
Yeah.
And in your case, probably the limit is how much money you make every month and how much money of that you can pay for that lending.
Yeah.
The countries have the same problem.
Yeah.
There is a lot of funding, but the country has a limited amount of resources that they generate.
And their credit rating.
Well, the credit rating is the result of the basics, which is how much richness they produce, how much they export, how much they spend in imports, how much money they mismanage, how much money they spend in social needs. And then there is the capacity to repay a loan. So the rating is the result of all these combinations. And you can give the countries so much money because that is the money that they will be able to repay. What is the finance? People believe that finance is the creation of money from nowhere. Finance comes from the savings of other people, of other countries. So those people that are prepared to save and create those funds through the banks, that money that's being saved by some people is being lent to some other people. But you lend money to someone, you expect that one that's going to pay you back with probably an additional profit. So it's not a problem that there is the finance available, it's a problem of those who are going to take the money, who has the right accounts and use the money properly. The idea of how we can increase the finance for climate, well, there are ways, technical ways to do it. But countries are looking for money, and sometimes they believe is that climate change finance is a little bit cheaper, as I said before, but also could be a parallel line of lending that could come in addition to what they already get.
Yeah.
But the efficiency of the operation of the countries and how they spend their money is what will put the limit of how much money they can get and how many projects they can implement.
It's a really good point, though. A lot of it is related to good governance at the country and local level. Yeah, before we go to some questions from the audience, did you want to add to that?
Certainly, I really agree with what Jorge and Klaus are saying. And I would say two additional words. To mobilize additional finance for sustainable transport, we need understanding and willpower. Understanding means knowing how much the technology and the infrastructure that you want to invest in is going to work in practice, how it's going to apply in your local jurisdiction, and whether the new technologies like electric drive cost more, or in some cases they may cost less. Electric drive technologies will cost less than gasoline and diesel vehicles per mile. Once you have that understanding, then it's the willpower. We just came back from a mission in India, visiting with Ministry of Power, Ministry of Environment, and Ministry of Urban. They now have the understanding that their 500,000 vehicles in their public government fleet spend more on gasoline and diesel operation than if they were converted to electric drive. And they are now mustering the willpower to develop a plan to convert their entire public fleet to electric drive. So the financing is already there because they're already paying for those vehicles. That is a great lesson, I think. Understanding and willpower.
Very good example of sort of that upfront cost that needs to be made once you have the understanding, the willpower to make the transition. Really good example. So I understand we have a couple questions from the audience. We'll move there next, and then I actually have one for you too. Great, thank you.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. It's Bronwyn Thornton from Walk 21, and it's been great to hear that they're funding the technology, that we're changing the way we fuel our vehicles and we move them around in the transport system. It's very appealing to fund technology. There's lots of private money in technology as well. But what about our current low carbon modes? What about walking and cycling? And how do we get funding attention for these modes? Because they're not part of the problem. They've been part of the solution from the beginning. And they have broader social benefits beyond transport, so there might be a bit of silo breakdown here as well around health, social cohesion, local economies, independent mobility. I appreciate scale is an issue, but technology is very seductive. So how do we bring back these historically and perpetually important low carbon modes into this funding discussion?
Thank you. Let's take the second question because we're running, and we can answer them in mass. That's a really great question. So the second question together.
Yeah, thank you. My name is James Kogan. I work for a group called Ethanol Europe, and we finance and build renewable energy projects. I fully accept the points that two of the gentlemen made about the maturity of the project developers. The International Energy Agency forecasts that in order to reach, our climate goals as a society, we'll need to use biofuels as about to the point that it accounts for about a third of our energy consumption in 2050. So it's as important as electromobility and efficiency in terms of being one of the three main pillars of transport decarbonisation. Our experience in terms of financing projects has often, and I'd just ask your comments on these, run into trouble for two reasons. One is policy stability, because long-term structural projects that require changes in the way things are done need a huge amount of public support over a long period of time. So we have, if you're operating in a situation where there are shifts and U-turns in policy direction quite frequently, then these things come asunder. The second thing is that development banks need a level of expertise that is also, entails agility, entrepreneurship, ability to help project developers develop those projects. So I would say that in addition to the ability of project developers, I would say policy stability and also the expertise of the lending banks, if you'd comment on those.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm not quite sure where the question exactly was in that second one, but let's see what we have here. The first one is, the walking and cycling are sort of the lowest, the least technical. Is there easy finance for that, or how does that work?
Most of the work that we do with the cities are trying to come from a broader perspective than just finance a transport project. And you will see that in most of those places, not only the big infrastructure is built, but we have been financing cycle lanes in many cities, bicycle systems. In most of these places, they have widened the sidewalks, they have closed streets for traffic, and they made the pedestrian streets. And there are a number of examples in where we have been involved in the big finance in terms of the amount of money that is required for big transformations, but in parallel, we are promoting through very integral plans, and we have a project that is, or a program is called Cities with a Future, where we try to help the government not only to look at one project within the transportation system as well only, but also look at other sectors. So this transformation tends to be integral, thinking more in the needs of the people than in just the will of the government to build one project, which sometimes has more objectives than just the interest of the people or the need for the service.
And you mentioned safety early as a priority, and that's often having to do with pedestrians and cyclists and what have you, feel free to answer either or both questions as we go around. Did you want to say anything else about the other question on the biofuels? It was kind of hard to hear the whole approach, but I think it was that how much is biofuels a part of the equation going forward to 2050 to answer climate change? And maybe we can just touch on that related to transportation or financing, if you feel like you want to touch on that. And do you want to? We'll move on to the next.
Well, let me just weigh in. I really appreciate the question about the role for walking and biking. And the Jeff, along with our partners, has launched the Global Platform for Sustainable Cities, now with 11 countries, 23 cities participating. And the emphasis in that program is very much on the topic you raised, which is to help the city planners develop the tools and the techniques for long-term planning with urban design principles that minimize the need for powered transport by providing for walking, biking, and work near home. That's a very important process. It's also a very long-term process that will take years and decades to roll out, but it's critical. So in our cities now, where transport needs are right now, we believe the new technologies, the electric drive, the other alternative fuels that have a low carbon footprint are tremendously vital to help our countries lower their carbon footprint and solve their air quality problems. I wanted to pick up on one other point. I do agree that in many times the capacity of our own institutions needs to grow. We need to be able to respond with agility to the changes in the private sector. And you only have to look at what Tesla is doing in Australia and Haiti and with electric drive to see maybe they're moving faster than we are. So we always have to keep up, and I really appreciate that comment.
That's great. And our final comment?
Two quick answers. I think we only for a couple of years we have more requests for funding non-motorized transport. But this is encouraging that our partners are coming and say, hey guys, we have a problem with integrating non-motorized transport to our bus system, to our subway system, what have you. So it's coming. As someone who is driving to his work every day by bike, I would like to see substantially more. A quick one to the role of biofuels. I'm sure even in the 30 years to come, biofuels will have a role in some places, and I'm not as optimistic as you, for instance, with regards to electric mobility. I believe we should not simply replace the normal car that is known for the last 100 years with an electric-driven one. We need to be more transformative. Public transport, also non-motorized transport, and in some areas where the power system is weak And I have in mind many African countries. I think the traditional car will have a very important role for many countries, for many years to come. And also for instance, aviation fuel, biofuels may be one way to address an avenue towards sustainable transport.
Very good point. Excellent. I think what we've seen tonight is very refreshing in the fact that integration of the sustainable mobility for all themes of like safety, efficiency, low carbon, accessibility is really being integrated by the finance community writ large. I mean, by development banks and by the funds, et cetera, by the United Nations. That's really refreshing to hear, that complete streets, the idea that walking isn't, you know, it's not hippy dippy, it's actually, it's being financed. That's fantastic. So, of course, and it's good to hear we just need to get more bankable projects out there, and that there's the resources and the you know, people dedicated to do that. So I can't thank my guests enough for taking the extra few moments it needed to pull questions from the audience. That's very much appreciated. If you'd like to ask questions for the future talk shows, these are tomorrow night and then the 4 weekdays next week as well. It's #WeAreTransport. Please send them in. We have questions in the wings waiting for the right talk shows, that some are on electric mobility, etc., which we're talking about tomorrow night. If you don't mind waiting for 1 second, we'll just wrap up. Tomorrow night's theme is electric mobility and innovation. Then we don't have them talk show over the weekend, but next week we have a series every night, including some really great speakers about the future of transportation, etc. I want to thank again, we're here at the DHL headquarters in Post Tower. Thanks them for hosting, as well as PPMC for sponsoring this. And from COP23, the UNFCCC, Climate Change Talks, thank you so very much. And thanks to the audience as well.